Шановні колеги,
Dear colleague, we start our briefing, presentation of the UN Social Cohesion and Reconciliation Index for Eastern Ukraine, USC. 2018 results. Our guest is Stan Veitsman, UN Peace and Development Advisor. You're welcome.
I apologize because I'm going to speak in English, so those who need, please get some headphones. My name is Stan, and together with Darina, Therese, and Ilda, we are the UN Youth team. On the 13th of August 2016, the Cabinet of Ministers adopted a state target program for recovery and peace building in eastern Ukraine. The program comprises three pillars. The first is infrastructure and social services, recovery of infrastructure and social services, which will take a lot of money. The second is economic recovery, jobs and so forth, which will also take a lot of money. And the third component is social resilience, peace building, community security, and social cohesion. That part doesn't require that much money, but the government's philosophy is that that part makes the entire recovery of the east of Ukraine workable. Because there's no point doing recovery of roads, buildings, infrastructure if we cannot restore the social fabric. And the social fabric is based on social cohesion, the relationships between people, and between people and the institutions that serve them. Now, since 2014, the United Nations, 17 agencies, funds, and programs in Ukraine have been working in the east of Ukraine on humanitarian, on human rights, on recovery, on peace building, and a range of other activities. And to help us understand the societal dynamics and design programs that address the actual needs of the people and better respond to the context of the east of Ukraine. In 2016, three agencies, the UN Development Programme, the UN Children's Fund, and the International Organization for Migration, launched UCE. UCE is the United Nations Social Cohesion and Reconciliation Index for Eastern Ukraine. We're just going to call it UCE. It comprises two main components, a general population survey and a special survey focused on adolescents. Today, we want to share with you the results of the adult population, the main one. But before I do that, we need to explain a little bit about use and social cohesion. What you see on the screen now is a typical annual cycle. We do use in an annual wave, once a year. And this is important because the second circle, going clockwise, the conceptual modeling to understand what is social cohesion in the context of Ukraine is where we need to listen to the Ukrainian people. So this is where we engage hundreds of stakeholders, both in Kyiv and in the 5 oblasts of eastern Ukraine, to help us understand and define social cohesion in Ukraine. Once we do the survey, the questionnaire, the field work, once we process the data, we then go back and sit down with our friends and colleagues and try to help, or rather ask them to help us understand what does this mean. So what you're about to see is based on wide-ranging consultations because we don't really understand Ukraine and we need the Ukrainian people to help us get through it. I should mention at the outset, and then we'll take questions at the end, that this is based on 6,000 face-to-face surveys in the 5 oblasts of east of Ukraine, in the government-controlled areas of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, and in Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, and Dnipropetrovsk. In Luhansk and Donetsk, we actually go down to rayon level because it is important to understand the minor or even big differences between places that can be close to each other. Now, on the basis of these consultations, last year we defined social cohesion in the context of the east of Ukraine as this. These four parts together allow us to understand social cohesion. Use is based on the SCORE methodology, initially developed by SEED in Cyprus. And it has been used in several countries since. But the methodology may remain the same, but the context changes. In Cyprus, for example, the conflict has an ethnic dimension and a religious dimension, which isn't so present here in Ukraine. That's why it's important for us to engage people and understand what it means in eastern Ukraine. And here, in the east of Ukraine, social cohesion is the combination of readiness for dialogue, number one, tolerant and active citizenship, reducing violent tendencies, and also reducing or mitigating negative migration trends. The four of these things together help us to understand and measure social cohesion in the east of Ukraine. And this helps us to create projects and programs, and a lot of you folks to understand what's really going on out there. For those of you who haven't fallen asleep yet, now we get to the fun bit. Having just concluded the second wave of use, we can also compare for the first time how things are changing. So now we'd like to present in the next 15 minutes some of the main things that we have found, and then we'll take questions and answers. Everything, including outcomes and all the data, is already available on the website, Score for Peace, and we'll put up the website at the end. So if you can hold off on your questions until the end, and bear with me. So, use is not just a perception survey. It is an advanced analytical tool that provides both a descriptive and predictive analysis using more than 70 indicators. And each of these indicators is presented as a score from 0 to 10, meaning 0, it is not there, and 10, it is very strongly there. If we look at the main results from this year, what we can see is, number one, there's an increased trust in central institutions. And by central institutions, we mean the president, parliament, the courts, etc. That's good news. The bad news is when the trust has increased from 1.6 to 2.2, it means there's still a long way to go. But at least we're moving in the right direction. Not so good, people are feeling less secure. That's the third major finding down there. However, the rest of it does seem to be positive because people are more ready to enter into dialogue with people living in non-government controlled areas. And people also see residents of non-government controlled areas as being less of a threat than they appeared to be last year. Finally, but also quite importantly, there is an increased rejection of a military solution, that is, less support for militarization. Overall, what we see this year is that there is more support for a peaceful resolution. There is a higher level of conflict fatigue, but there are also some concerns and pessimistic view of the future. These are the main changes from last year to this year, and there are many more. This is what we call the big picture. But the big picture doesn't tell us too much, because it's important to go deeper. And the deeper we go, the more we'll find out. Here we have what we call a heat map. And the heat map allows us to see exactly where there is more or less of a problem. As I said, the three adjoining oblasts, Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, and Zaporizhia, we have a score at the oblast level. In Donetsk and Luhansk, we have scores at rayon level. Because if we look, for example, at Center Luhansk, and I don't have a pointer, so I'm just going to walk. Sorry, I said Central Donetsk, and just below southern, you see a difference from 2.2 to 1.0. That is a big difference. So it's important for us to understand why is that different and what can we do about it. Now, overall, what we see here, and this is a heat map showing us the level of trust in central institutions, where we have 0, signifying that nobody anywhere has any trust in any central institution, and 10, signifying that everyone everywhere has complete trust in all central institutions. Where we sit on the scale is an average of 2.2. So that is quite a long way to go. So that's a heat map, and this is one of the products that you'll see on the website and one of the things that helps us to understand what's happening out there. Now, moving along, he says, there we go. One of the main outcomes, as you remember, those 4 things that make up social cohesion, is dialogue. In order to strengthen social cohesion in the east of Ukraine, we need to promote dialogue. That's what the conceptual model told us. Dialogue is defined as seeing mutual benefit in interacting with representatives of different political, social, and geographic groups. In other words, just to be clear about what we're talking about, dialogue is willing to listen and understand others. And what did we find? Did that just go a very long way? It did. There we go. What we found is that readiness for dialogue is fairly high and is increasing across all 8 groups. The 8 groups that you see on the screen were identified by stakeholders during that conceptual design consultations that we did in the beginning of the cycle in eastern Ukraine and here in Kyiv. These 8 groups represent, there are more, but these 8 represent the sorts of groups that people may see as a threat or may wish to dialogue with. And what we see across the board is increasing readiness to dialogue with these groups. There are significant increases on the part of people living in eastern Ukraine to enter into dialogue with people living in non-government controlled areas, people who support closer ties with the EU, and so-called Ukrainian nationalists. You will see the change on the right side of the screen, the highest change being 0.6. A 0.5 or higher is what we would call a significant change. So those 3 first groups, there has been a significant improvement in the willingness of people in eastern Ukraine to enter into dialogue with these groups. There has also been an increase for all other groups, but these 3 are significant. At the same time, Ukrainian nationalists, together with people who support the separation of the non-government territories, and you'll see them down below at 5.3, these 2 groups still remain the least attractive of all of these for people in eastern Ukraine to enter into dialogue with. Now, what this tells us is that there is a negative attitude, or rather some hesitation, to dialogue with groups who hold a firm political position, because these political positions or political polarization is related to the conflict. What this also tells us is that there is not, at least in the perception of residents of Eastern Ukraine, an East-West divide. It is artificial because if you look at the fourth group, people from Western Ukraine sits on 6.8 with a 0.4 improvement. In other words, people in the east of Ukraine are very willing to enter into dialogue with people from Western Ukraine. And they make the distinction between, I'll slow down, between those living in Western Ukraine and those who are perceived to be Ukrainian nationalists. There we go. So far, what we see with these heat maps and with these numbers is pretty much what we would call a perception survey. But as I said, use allows us to do predictive analysis. And how do we do that? Well, what you see in front of you now is one example of a model. This is the model on dialogue. To understand what and how we can improve on the basis of what the use data, the indicators, show us, we use such models. You will see on the right of the screen, readiness for dialogue with all groups. Remember, this is one of the 4 main outcomes on how to improve social cohesion. In order to understand how to do that, the modeling tells us that the 4 indicators, or the 4 things that have the strongest influence on a person's readiness to dialogue with others, is civic empowerment and pro-social skills, which have a blue line. And that blue line means there is a positive relationship. In other words, if we were to increase the sense of empowerment and the pro-social skills of a person, that person would be more likely to enter into dialogue with others. The other 2 things that have a significant influence are, with the red lines, social threat and negative stereotypes. The red line has a negative relationship. People who feel that there is a social threat from other groups are less likely to want to dialogue. And people who hold negative stereotypes of other groups are less likely to dialogue. The thicker the line, the stronger the influence. So what we can see in this model is, on the basis of results this year, negative stereotypes about all groups have the strongest influence on a person's readiness for dialogue. Great, it's good to know that. What can we do with it? The things that are more difficult to see, because they're shaded, is what we call looking behind the screen. These are the drivers of the drivers. These are the things that influence the things that influence. And by drawing connections, and we won't put this up because it's very complicated and I can't explain it. Before we put that up, for example, what we see is that if we reduce, he says, looking at his screen because he can't really read Ukrainian, looking at civic empowerment, if we were to increase the level of security, I think that's the first grey box, we are likely to increase a person's sense of empowerment. If we were to increase their level of wealth through job generation, through training, through small grants, they would again feel more empowered and therefore more ready to enter into dialogue. And this modeling is important for us, and it is important for our partners, including the Oblast and national administration, because this helps us to understand what it is we can do, moving from left to right, to strengthen and restore social cohesion. Now, I'll leave that one there because in the few minutes remaining, I also want to tell you a little bit more about some of the other findings we have. The other outcome that you will remember from the beginning is active and tolerant citizenship. And citizenship, or rather civic participation, is a very important part of a democratic society. But active citizenship is not necessarily a positive thing, because as we have seen in many contexts, in many countries, those that tend to be more active are sometimes also more radical. So the challenge here is, how do we create tolerant and active citizenship together? And the findings for this year are that the level of social tolerance across eastern Ukraine is fairly similar and fairly good. So in terms of tolerance, we have a good starting point. In terms of civic engagement, one of the indicators of civic engagement is the availability of opportunities for civic engagement. And again, with an average of 6.2, this is fairly good, with the exception of communities close to the contact line. In Donetsk, average of 4.4, in Luhansk, an average of 4.5. So availability is good, but if we go back to the big picture, what is the actual level of civic engagement? What we see is a pretty bleak picture. The actual engagement is on an average of 2.4. What the analysis or the data tells us is people in the east of Ukraine are willing to engage in activities with neighbors, with NGOs, with people they know. But they are less likely to engage in activities involved by, organized by the authorities or that involve the authorities. And again, if we remember the low level of trust in central institutions, this is not too surprising. So what we know is that the low level of actual engagement is not due to the lack of opportunities. It is due to the sense of agency, that people do not feel that their action and their engagement, their involvement, will make a real change in their community and in their life. Something else that we can do with the data is to combine the indicators of what is an active citizen and what is a tolerant citizen, and by putting them together, we can create 4 typical people. A tolerant passive person, a tolerant active, an intolerant passive, and an intolerant active. And this allows us to understand what characteristics each of these groups have, so that we know what sort of person we're looking for in order to identify a group. For example, if we look at the intolerant active, my favorite, a typically intolerant active person is someone who is likely to justify violence or the use of violence, someone who has strong negative stereotypes about others, someone who feels more threatened by different people, and someone who is more anxious than others around them. So we have active and not active, we have tolerant and not tolerant, and combining these, we can create typical characteristics of each group. What we can then do is, by putting those heat maps that we showed you together, we can identify where these groups are more or less present. And for example, if we look at the bottom row, we see that, let me look at the bottom row in a language I understand, along the contact line, we have a lot of tolerant people, a total of 64%, but most of those are passive. So if we want to increase tolerant sit at home, watch TV, to tolerant get out and do something good, that is probably the one area we would want to target, because that might be an easier shift. And how to do that, you will find on the website in the brief. Next, 2 more things that we'd like to share briefly. Migration tendency. So migration is another desired outcome out of those 4 that we showed in the beginning. And migration is in itself not necessarily a bad thing. It's natural. People move for work, people move for holidays. Where it does have problem is if for the wrong reasons too many people move all at once, it creates a brain drain, a loss of human capital, and a bleak outlook for the future. So what we have here is a measure of migration tendency. This is not the actual level of migration. This is an indication of the desire of people in the east of Ukraine that if they could, they would leave. And what we have is an average of 4.4. But again, the importance of dropping down from the big picture into the details is if we look at Donetsk, and especially Luhansk, we see that over the past year there has been a big rise. So, using the data, we're then able to understand what is behind this. And this is another type of model that we have, and it shows the main drivers of migration tendency in the east of Ukraine. Again, the red lines are the negative, the blue lines are the positive, and the thicker the line, the stronger the influence. And what we find is that, number one, migration tendency is much stronger among younger people, the 18 to 35. Migration tendency there is at a level of 5.6. The main reason for why all people in all age groups want to live are, number one, not jobs or economic opportunity, as we suspected, it is civic empowerment. Oddly enough, the continuous theme here is that the reason people want to leave is that they feel that they're not able to influence, achieve, or change their life, their community for the better. The second reason, common to all groups, is locality dissatisfaction. Locality dissatisfaction means, is this a happy place? Do I have cinemas, theaters, kindergartens? Is it safe? Do the lights work? And again, it appears that most people in the east of Ukraine are not happy with the place they live. Fear of internal destabilization is another common driver. And I'll repeat that, fear of internal destabilization as opposed to an external threat. We make the distinction in both the questionnaire and the analysis. What this tells us is people are more concerned with poor governance, with corruption, with crime rates, than with any external threats. This is also important because it shows us the differences between groups, between men, women, between rural, urban, and age groups. And one of the differences we see is that for the young people, one of the main reasons they wish to leave is the lack of provision of services. So young people leaving means social capital is flowing out of eastern Ukraine. The older group, they're driven by a lack of trust in institutions and by qualified professional skills that will give them a better life elsewhere. That means a brain drain. So what we're seeing is a brain drain and a loss of social capital in eastern Ukraine. I will finish up with the last little bit that we did this year, which was a special focus on communities close to the line of contact on government-controlled territories. Now, as I hope you understood by now, we need to look into the details to understand how things may appear similar, but actually can be quite different, almost in the same area. And the results from the contact line analysis this year show us that there are very distinct challenges and strengths in the communities along the contact line of Donetsk Oblast and Luhansk Oblast that are different from the rest of that oblast. There are also big differences between the contact line communities in Donetsk Oblast and the contact line communities in Luhansk Oblast. So let's keep in mind that the Donbass is not one big happy place, it's actually several quite different areas. What is common to the contact line communities is they feel isolated, they feel abandoned, and they feel neglected. And in the last 30 seconds, thank you for staying awake, some of the reasons why they feel this way. Well, unsurprisingly, the level of personal security is lower at the contact line than it is in the rest of the oblast. But again, this is personal security not just because these communities are close to the armed conflict. And yes, they are. They hear shelling, they hear shooting, they see it. There are mines and unexploded ordnance. But this is personal security. Do I feel safe walking the streets at night? Are the police around? Are they able to help? And what we found here is that in particular, older women in these communities feel very insecure. So the analysis also helps us to understand the who and the where and the what can we do. Another example is quality of roads. Again, much lower along the contact line than in the rest of the oblast. Now, this is a perception of the people that were responding to our question. We understand that there has been a lot done this year on roadwork, but the perception remains that these communities remain isolated, and maybe it is the distance, because the access of services, the delivery of services, the ability of the police and security providers to respond quickly. The people in these communities still believe that this is quite low. The next indicator is economic opportunities. Yes, again, unsurprisingly, much lower if we look especially at Donetsk. Don't see much of a future here. No jobs, this place isn't going anywhere. This is the perception of people living there. And, oh, okay, I guess I've spoken too much. Several other indicators. Oh, that's a shame because the last slide was actually going to be the website that I promised you. Oh, thank you. Economic, what's the next one? Okay, drinking water. Here's another example. This indicator actually reads in reverse, so the higher the number, the more of a shortage or the more of a problem it is. And what we can see is in Donetsk, contact line community have a much higher shortage of drinking water than elsewhere. But to finish on a positive and to remind you of the few things I've already mentioned, if we look at neighborhood support, for example, we see that this is higher for communities along the contact line than in the rest of the oblast. Overall, there is a higher sense of self-reliance and reliance on neighbors, on fellow residents. Let's also recall that what we showed you earlier, that there are higher levels of tolerance and there are definitely higher levels of the desire to be more active and more engaged, but the opportunities in these areas are less so. So, in conclusion, when we look at the contact line communities, what do we see? Well, we see tremendous untapped potential for social capital, for strengthening civic engagement and governance processes, especially in the context of decentralization, and for creating a solid base for the peaceful reintegration of the non-government controlled areas. I will finish up there and happy to take any questions and comments, but for everything I've said and much, much, much more, please visit the website and you'll see there 5 analytical briefs on the 5 main issues we covered today, but also all the data so you can make your own heat map, your own indicators, and anything that you're interested in. You'll have our contact details there, and we're happy to come along and provide additional information. So thank you for staying, and I'm happy to take any questions. All clear. Oh, there's a website. Here you go.
Якщо у аудиторії немає запитань, то ми
If there are no questions from the audience, I would like to thank our speaker and all the members of the audience. Дякую.